Dawn settled gently over the jungles of New Guinea, heavy with moisture and stillness. A pale light crept along the coastline as mist lifted from the trees and drifted toward the airfields at Wewak. From a distance, nothing appeared unusual. It was a familiar morning, quiet, humid, and predictable. War felt far away, held back by miles of sea and dense jungle. On the ground, aircraft rested in neat rows, arranged with quiet efficiency. Crews moved calmly between them, checking instruments, securing panels, and wiping condensation from metal surfaces warming under the rising sun. Engines were started one by one, their steady sound reassuring. Fuel tanks were full. Another routine mission was expected. Confidence had become normal. No sirens disturbed the air. No urgent messages came through the radios. Lookouts scanned the horizon more out of habit than concern. Months of isolation had created a sense of safety, the belief that distance alone was protection. Then, without warning, the sky shifted. Shapes emerged from the clouds' aircraft, descending fast, silent until the final moments. Their outlines were unfamiliar. Their approach felt wrong. There was no time to understand, no time to react. Events unfolded faster than orders could be given. Within moments, the airfields were engulfed in chaos. Aircraft were lost where they stood. Smoke rose where order had existed only minutes earlier. Heat shimmered above twisted metal. A force carefully prepared, confident and intact, was suddenly gone without ever leaving the ground. The destruction did not remain confined to a single strip of runway. Almost at once, the explosions began to echo from other points along the Wewak complex, Borum, Dagwa, but airfields separated by jungle and distance, yet struck as if by a single hand. The pattern was unmistakable. This was not a raid that stumbled upon a target. It was an operation timed to the minute, designed to break an entire system in one morning. On the ground, mechanics and armorers ran without direction, not because they lacked courage, but because there was nowhere safe to move. Parked bombers detonated in sequence as fire reached fuel lines and loaded ordnance. Each blast fed the next. Metal fragments scythed across open ground. The air filled with the choking smell of aviation fuel and burning rubber, and with the sound sharp, percussive, final of aircraft being erased. Anti-aircraft crews reacted as doctrine demanded, but doctrine was useless against what they could not see. Guns swung upward and opened fire into cloud and glare, tracers arcing blindly through empty sky. The attackers were already past their most vulnerable moment. The rounds came late, scattered, and without effect. At 10,000 feet, the defenders were still trying to understand what they were looking at. Men died beside machines they had never flown that day. Pilots who had expected routine missions were caught on ladders, near cockpits, or in the open, sprinting toward revetments that did not exist. Ground crew trained to service aircraft, not to survive direct bombardment, were crushed by debris or consumed by fuel-fed flames. In those first minutes, the airfields became less a battlefield than an execution ground. Then the voice of command began to vanish. Telephone lines were severed. Radio nets filled with overlapping reports. Then with silence as transmitters were destroyed or abandoned. In the absence of clear orders, survival became individual, not organized. The machinery of coordination so essential to air power collapsed under the weight of shock. When the smoke thickened and the attackers turned away, the survivors stared upward with the same question, raw and unresolved. How had the enemy reached Wewak without warning? And as the fires continued to burn, another realization settled in. This had not felt like combat. It had felt like removal. In the hours that followed, the first reports moved slowly and uncertainly through what remained of the command structure. Initial damage estimates were cautious, almost restrained, shaped as much by disbelief as by lack of information. Aircraft destroyed were counted in handfuls, then in squadrons. Each update arrived heavier than the last, forcing revisions that no one wanted to make. As smoke cleared and reconnaissance flights dared to rise, the scale of the disaster became impossible to soften. Runways were cratered, dispersal areas were blackened. Rows of aircraft that had existed at dawn were now only scorched outlines on the ground. Photographs returned with brutal clarity, confirming what survivors already suspected. This had not been a localized loss. It was comprehensive. By midday, the numbers settled into something final. Close to 60 bombers, many of them operational, fueled, and crewed, had been destroyed or rendered unusable in a matter of hours. In one morning, nearly an entire regional air force had vanished. It was a loss that normally required months of combat to produce, now delivered without a single aerial duel. Japanese commanders resisted the figures instinctively. They asked for recounts, for confirmation from other fields, for explanations that might reduce the scale. There were none. No reports of dogfights. No claims of enemy losses that might balance the ledger. The destruction had occurred almost entirely on the ground, where doctrine and honor offered no defense. What made the blow so destabilizing was not only its size, but its nature. Air power was supposed to be contested in the sky, tested by skill and courage. This loss felt different, unearned by combat. Immune to bravery, it carried the weight of humiliation, the sense that something fundamental had been misunderstood. Slowly, an idea that had governed planning began to fracture. Distance had failed. Concealment had failed. The belief that certain bases were beyond reach no longer held. As the final tallies were written, another realization emerged alongside them. If this could happen at Wewak, it could happen anywhere. And with that thought, a strategic illusion quietly collapsed. Wewak was not chosen by accident. Along the northeastern coast of New Guinea, it had grown into Japan's principal air hub in the region, a carefully positioned node in a widening defensive arc. From its runways, bombers and fighters could reach Allied positions across the Solomon Sea, threaten shipping lanes, and contest advances toward the Philippines. On maps in Tokyo and Rabaul, Wewak appeared as a linchpin, a place from which control radiated outward. Its value lay not only in location, but in reach. Aircraft based at Wewak supported operations stretching hundreds of miles in every direction, linking isolated garrisons and projecting power over vast contested spaces. As long as its airfields remained intact, Japanese planners believed they retained initiative in northeastern New Guinea. Wewak was more than a base. It was a promise that the perimeter still held. Geography seemed to confirm that belief. The surrounding jungle was dense, unforgiving, and largely unmapped. Mountains rose inland. Weather shifted without warning, and coastal approaches were long and exposed. Distance itself was treated as a defensive weapon. Enemy aircraft, it was assumed, simply could not reach Wewak in strength, let alone arrive with surprise. Maps became arguments. Miles became reassurance. This assumption hardened into doctrine. Allied aircraft were believed to lack the range, the navigation, precision, and the endurance required for deep strikes. Even if they tried, planners reasoned, losses would be prohibitive. The jungle, the sea, and the sheer scale of the Pacific were expected to impose limits no pilot could overcome. Wewak existed beyond those limits, or so it seemed. The environment reinforced the illusion. Isolation bred familiarity, and familiarity bred comfort. Day after day, the same routines unfolded beneath the same oppressive heat. Aircraft arrived, were serviced, refueled, and lined up again. The jungle pressed close, absorbing sound, concealing movement, and offering a false sense of invisibility. Nothing about the setting suggested urgency. For efficiency, aircraft were concentrated rather than dispersed. Tight formations reduced taxi time, simplified maintenance, and eased command and control. Defensive measures were secondary, shaped by the conviction that the real fight would happen elsewhere. Preparation focused outward, toward offensive missions, not inward, toward survival on the ground. Over time, confidence stopped being a conscious judgment and became habit. When assumptions go unchallenged long enough, they turn into routine. And routine, in war, has a way of disguising danger. At Wewak, the belief in safety had settled so deeply that it no longer needed defending, just as the enemy was learning how to exploit it. At Wewak, geography was not just a backdrop to strategy. It became the strategy itself. Distance, terrain, and climate were treated as substitutes for layered air defense. Where radar stations and interceptor patrols were scarce, maps were expected to compensate. The long approach routes over open sea and dense jungle were assumed to exhaust any attacker before they could threaten the airfields below. Because of that faith, dispersal felt unnecessary. Aircraft were parked close together to conserve space and labor, not because commanders were careless, but because they saw no credible reason to do otherwise. Spreading machines across hidden revetments required time, materials, and manpower resources better spent, they believed, on offensive operations. Protection was postponed in favor of efficiency. Technical warning systems reflected the same mindset. Radar coverage in the region was limited, inconsistent, and often dismissed as unreliable in tropical conditions. Sets malfunctioned in heat and humidity. Operators were unevenly trained, and confidence in early detection remained low. Instead, the first line of warning rested on human senses lookouts scanning the horizon, ears trained for distant engine noise, judgment shaped by experience rather than instrumentation. This reliance on eyesight and intuition had once served Japanese forces well, especially during the early mobile phases of the war. But at Wewak, it hardened into complacency. Without continuous patrols or integrated warning networks, surprise became possible in theory, even if it was denied in practice. The absence of alarms was interpreted not as vulnerability, but as confirmation that none were needed. Underlying these choices was doctrine. Japanese air thinking emphasized offensive spirit, speed, and the initiative of the attacker. Defense was secondary, often viewed as a passive posture that dulled aggressiveness. To disperse, to dig in, to prepare for being struck, these were acts that implied weakness. Better to strike first than to imagine being struck at all. As a result, the idea of surprise at such depth was quietly dismissed. Wewak lay too far from Allied bases. The risks to any attacker would be too great. The jungle would conceal approaches, the distance would break formations, and fatigue would do the rest. These beliefs were repeated often enough to become truths. But belief, untested, has a dangerous habit of replacing preparation. At Wewak, defenses were shaped not by what the enemy might attempt, but by what planners believed he could not. And somewhere beyond the horizon, that belief was already being measured mile by mile, calculation by calculation. For Allied air planners, the war in the Pacific was revealing an uncomfortable truth. Traditional attrition meeting enemy aircraft in the sky, trading losses sortie by sortie was slow, costly, and uncertain. The distances were too vast, the replacement rates too uneven. If air power was to decide the campaign, it would have to do so more efficiently. The question was no longer how to fight enemy aircraft, but how to remove them from the fight altogether. Gradually, a different priority took shape. Intelligence reports showed enemy aircraft massed on the ground, concentrated at bases assumed to be safe. Destroying planes before they took off promised results no dogfight could match. It was an idea rooted in logic, rather than bravado. An aircraft burned on a runway required no chase, no escort, no heroic engagement. It simply ceased to exist. To make that idea viable, planners had to solve problems that doctrine said were unsolvable. Long-range missions were studied in quiet rooms, away from routine briefings. Routes were sketched and erased, then redrawn again. Timing had to be exact, because endurance left no margin for delay. These were not flights meant to test defenses, they were meant to arrive unseen, strike once, and vanish. Navigation became a discipline of calculation rather than confidence. Over open sea and trackless jungle, there were few landmarks and fewer second chances. Dead reckoning, celestial fixes, and weather forecasts were cross-checked obsessively. A single error could mean missing the target entirely or running out of fuel with nothing beneath but water or trees. Fuel margins were pushed to their limits. Aircraft took off heavier than doctrine preferred. Engines tuned for economy rather than power. Crews were briefed on what to discard if weight became critical and on what could not be discarded at any cost. Every gallon had a purpose. Every mile was accounted for. Under these constraints, success depended less on courage than on synchronization. Dozens of aircraft had to arrive together, at the right altitude, in the right light. Too early, and warning might spread. Too late, and defenses could respond. Precision timing became the quiet center of the plan. This was not recklessness disguised as innovation. The risks were acknowledged fully and accepted anyway. Allied planners understood what failure would mean, but they also understood what caution had already cost. And so, deliberately, they chose a path that traded safety for surprise, trusting calculation over assumption as they prepared to fly where they were never expected to be. The breakthrough did not begin with aircraft or weapons, but with photographs. Reconnaissance flights long, exposed, and often dismissed as routine returned with images that told a quiet story. Airfields once thought dispersed appeared crowded, Bombers sat in long, orderly lines. Support vehicles clustered close. What planners saw in those images was not strength, but density machines gathered in ways that favored efficiency over survival. Signals intelligence added weight to what the photograph suggested. Intercepted communications, fragmentary but consistent, revealed rhythms beneath the surface of operations. Takeoff windows repeated. Maintenance cycles followed predictable patterns. Fuel deliveries arrived on schedule. None of it seemed reckless on its own, but together it formed a picture of habit. And in war, habit is something an enemy can learn. As analysts compared notes, patterns emerged that could not be ignored. Certain hours were quieter than others. Alert levels dipped after routine checks passed without incident. Aircraft were warmed in anticipation of missions that came at the same times, day after day. These were not mistakes. They were the natural result of confidence built over months of unchallenged control. What had once been efficiency was now exposure. Weather became the next variable to be mastered. Over New Guinea, cloud cover could hide an approach or shatter it. Storms built quickly and collapsed without warning. Winds at altitude shifted unpredictably. Mission planners studied forecasts with an intensity normally reserved for enemy movements. Cloud ceilings, sunrise angles, visibility windows, each factor could determine whether aircraft arrived unseen or announced themselves too early. Gradually, dozens of separate calculations began to converge. Distance, fuel consumption, engine performance, weather, enemy routine, all were laid over one another until only a narrow window remained. The margin for error was vanishingly small. If even one element slipped, the entire plan risked collapse. Yet within that narrow window lay something decisive: the possibility of arriving before the enemy believed arrival was possible. Surprise, once considered a bonus, became the central weapon. Not speed alone, not altitude, not numbers, but timing. The aim was not to fight the defenders, but to deny them the chance to fight at all. Every decision was measured against a single question: would this increase or diminish the element of surprise? To preserve that advantage, silence became policy. Briefings were limited, routes were compartmentalized, crews were told only what they needed to know, and often only when the moment approached. There would be no radio chatter, no early signals that might ripple outward. The first warning, planners intended, would be the sound of bombs already falling. This discipline ran against instinct. Pilots wanted clarity, commanders wanted redundancy. But innovation in war often requires restraint as much as action. By saying less, planners hoped to achieve more. By withholding information, they sought to protect it. When the final plans were approved, there was no sense of triumph, only tension. Everything now depended on whether intelligence had been read correctly, whether routine truly masked vulnerability, and whether silence could carry aircraft deep into enemy territory unseen. Somewhere far across sea and jungle, the enemy was going about another ordinary day, unaware that his predictability had become his greatest liability. The routes chosen for the mission were ones aviation manuals warned against. Long stretches of open sea gave way to dense jungle and rising terrain, areas where forced landings meant disappearance rather than rescue. These paths existed on maps only as thin lines of calculation, not as proven air corridors. To fly them was to challenge not just the enemy's expectations, but the limits of navigation itself. Altitude, timing, and approach were calibrated to contradict assumption. The aircraft did not climb where defenders expected them to climb, nor descend where interception seemed logical. They arrived neither at the edge of daylight nor under full darkness, but in a narrow interval when visibility worked against those on the ground. It was a choreography built on inversion, doing precisely what doctrine said should not work. For the crews, navigation was no longer a supporting task. It was survival. Over jungle and sea, there were no landmarks to forgive mistakes. A single error in heading or timing could place an aircraft miles off course, burning fuel it did not have. There would be no friendly bases below, no clearings large enough to land, no second attempt. Getting lost meant vanishing. They flew without escorts, deep into territory where interception would have been fatal. Fighters could not spare the range. Bombers would go alone, relying not on protection, but on invisibility and timing. It was an uncomfortable reality for airmen trained to expect formation strength and mutual defense. Here, survival depended on remaining unseen rather than undefeated. As the hours passed, The margin for error narrowed further. Fuel gauges crept downward, engines settled into their most economical rhythms, and crews calculated distances by instinct as much as by instrument. There was no room for improvisation. Every action had been decided in advance, because improvisation, at this range, meant unpredictability, and unpredictability burned fuel. In this environment, bravado had no place. Discipline replaced it entirely. Radio silence was maintained, despite the strain it imposed. Crews resisted the urge to confirm positions or reassure one another. Each aircraft held to its assigned role, trusting that others were doing the same beyond sight and sound. Confidence was internal, not expressed. This restraint was not passive. It was active control of engines, of altitude, of nerves. Pilots flew with the awareness that their greatest protection was not speed or armament, but the enemy's certainty that they should not be there at all. Every mile passed unchallenged reinforced that belief, even as it edged closer to collapse. Then, gradually, calculations began to align with reality. Landmarks appeared where they were expected. Timings held. Fuel reserves, thin as they were, remained within tolerance. The routes that had existed only on planning tables proved flyable. The impossible was becoming routine not because it was easy, but because it had been prepared without illusion. As the aircraft pressed on, still unobserved, the final test remained ahead. The plan had carried them farther than anyone on the ground at Wewak believed possible. Now it would answer a harder question: whether precision and restraint could deliver surprise at the moment it mattered most. On the airfields at Wewak, the morning unfolded without urgency. Pilots arrived expecting familiar orders, their thoughts shaped by routine rather than threat. Briefings were concise, technical, and unremarkable. Weather, fuel loads, target areas, nothing suggested deviation from the patterns of previous days. This was preparation for work, not for survival. Ground crews moved with practiced calm. Fuel hoses were connected, tanks topped off, and caps secured. Armorers loaded bombs and ammunition methodically, hands following motions repeated hundreds of times before. Tools were laid out, then gathered again. Each task was performed with quiet competence, shaped by experience rather than haste. The air smelled of fuel, oil, and damp earth ordinary scents on an operational airfield. There was no sense of imminent danger. No alarms, no alerts, no sudden changes in posture. Lookouts scanned the horizon, as they always had, seeing nothing that demanded attention. The absence of warning was itself reassuring. In war, silence often breeds anxiety, but at Wewak, silence had become normal. The belief that nothing could reach this far had settled into muscle memory. Engines began to turn over one by one. The sound spread across the field in waves, coughs, then steady roars as propellers blurred into motion. Pilots climbed ladders, adjusted straps, checked instruments. Some aircraft were minutes from taxiing. Others waited their turn. Engines warm, crews ready. Everything was proceeding on schedule. These familiar rhythms masked a deeper vulnerability. Aircraft sat close together, exposed by necessity and by confidence. Fuel trucks lingered nearby. Ammunition was already loaded. Efficiency had shaped the layout, not defense. What made the airfield function smoothly also made it fragile. But fragility is hard to see when nothing challenges it. Then surprise arrived without transition. There was no gradual escalation, no distant sound to interpret. The first indication was impact bombs striking among parked aircraft with immediate, irreversible effect. Explosions tore through the lines before engines could be shut down or aircraft dispersed. Fire raced across wings and fuselages already saturated with fuel. The rhythm of preparation shattered in an instant. Men froze, then ran, then fell. Orders could not be given because there was no time to give them. Pilots, who had expected to take off, found themselves trapped beside machines turning into furnaces. Ground crews abandoned tools and tasks that no longer mattered. The distance between routine and catastrophe collapsed to zero. Attempts to react dissolved under speed and violence. Anti-aircraft fire came too late. Engines could not be throttled down fast enough. There was no organized response because the moment for organization had already passed. The attack had been designed to arrive at precisely this point, when readiness was highest and awareness was lowest. In those first moments, survival depended entirely on chance. Where a man stood, which direction he ran, whether a fragment flew left or right. Training offered little guidance because this was not the scenario training imagined. The enemy was not ahead, or above, or approaching. He was already there. As smoke and fire spread across the airfields, the cruel irony became clear. The crews had done everything expected of them. Aircraft were prepared, fueled, and armed. Engines were warm. They were ready for battle, just not for this kind. And in that realization lay the final truth of Wewak's vulnerability. Readiness without awareness is indistinguishable from exposure. The first bombs did not fall near the aircraft. They fell among them. Metal struck metal with deliberate accuracy, tearing into parked bombers whose engines were still warm, whose fuel tanks were full, whose crews were only steps away. The impact points were not random. They were chosen to destroy machines before they could become weapons, to erase air power at its most vulnerable moment on the ground, motionless, exposed. What followed was not a series of isolated explosions, but a chain reaction. One aircraft ignited another. Fuel ignited ordnance. Ordnance ignited more fuel. The logic of destruction fed itself as fire leapt from wing to wing, fuselage to fuselage, turning careful spacing into liability. Each blast multiplied the next, amplifying the force beyond what the bombs alone could have achieved. Flames spread faster than men could move. Burning fuel ran along the ground, pooling beneath aircraft and igniting everything it touched. Smoke thickened almost immediately, reducing visibility to meters. The air became heavy, unbreathable, laced with heat and debris. What had been an orderly airfield moments earlier dissolved into a landscape of fire and noise. Within minutes, the runways themselves were no longer usable. Craters tore through concrete and packed earth. Wreckage skidded and burned across taxiways. Any thought of launching surviving aircraft vanished as surfaces buckled and flames cut off movement. Even undamaged planes were trapped, imprisoned by destruction around them. Aircraft burned faster than crews could flee. Aluminum skins softened and collapsed. Tires burst. Ammunition cooked off in unpredictable bursts, turning wreckage into active hazards. Men who had been trained to service and fly these machines now found themselves outrun by the very fires their work had helped make possible. The pace of destruction left no room for heroics. Defensive fire, where it existed, remained ineffective. Anti-aircraft guns fired upward through smoke and confusion, their operators aiming at sounds and guesses rather than targets. The attackers were already passing overhead, their critical work completed in seconds. The volume of fire increased, but its relevance did not. This was not a battle that could be influenced after it began. What made the moment decisive was not just the loss of aircraft, but the certainty of that loss. There would be no recovery phase, no regrouping, no second wave of defense. The destruction was irreversible, designed to leave nothing usable behind. The airfields were not suppressed. They were neutralized. In traditional air combat, superiority is contested through engagement fighters, meeting fighters, skill measured against skill. At Wewak, that contest never occurred. Air superiority was decided before engines could reach full power, before aircraft could leave the ground. It was decided through timing, intelligence, and the deliberate exploitation of vulnerability. As the attackers turned away, leaving fire and smoke behind them, the balance of power shifted with quiet finality. There would be no immediate counterstroke, no aerial retaliation that day. What remained on the ground could not fly, and what could not fly no longer mattered. In the span of minutes, an air force had been rendered irrelevant not by defeat in the sky, but by erasure on the ground. And as the smoke climbed higher over Wewak, the meaning of what had just occurred began to settle in. The decisive battle for control of the air had already been fought, and it had ended before anyone on the ground understood it had begun. In the immediate aftermath, Japanese command faced a problem no doctrine had prepared them for. The scale of the destruction defied quick assessment. Officers moved between shattered facilities, trying to piece together what had happened from fragments of testimony and incomplete reports. What remained of the command structure struggled to impose order on a situation that had unfolded faster than authority could respond. Reports arrived contradictory and confused. Some claimed a handful of aircraft lost. Others spoke of entire squadrons destroyed. Telephone lines lay severed beneath debris, and radio transmissions overlapped, broke apart, or vanished mid-sentence as equipment failed. Each attempt to clarify the picture only deepened the uncertainty. There was no single vantage point from which the truth could be seen clearly. Attempts to organize counterattacks quickly found their limits. Surviving aircraft, where they existed at all, were trapped by cratered runways and burning wreckage. Fuel supplies were compromised. Ammunition was scattered or exploding where it lay. Pilots who might have flown had no aircraft. Aircraft that might have flown had no safe path to the air. The idea of immediate retaliation collapsed under practical reality. As minutes stretched into hours, the sky above Wewak grew strangely empty. The familiar presence of friendly aircraft, departing, returning, circling, was gone. There were no patrols to reassure the ground crews, no engines overhead to suggest resilience. The absence itself became a signal, more powerful than any report. Control of the air had slipped away without ceremony. Survivors waited for orders that did not arrive. Men gathered in small groups, some tending to the wounded, others simply standing amid the wreckage, unsure of their role in what remained of the day. Command posts that had once hummed with activity were silent or destroyed. The chain of instruction that defined military life had fractured beyond repair. Gradually, the airfields took on a different character. Burned-out aircraft lined the runways like monuments to a vanished force. Twisted metal and blackened earth replaced the rhythms of maintenance and launch. The dead lay where they had fallen, and the living moved carefully among them, aware that the space had shifted from operational ground to something closer to a cemetery. With that transformation came a more enduring loss. Operational momentum built over months of planning, training, and expectation evaporated in a single morning. There would be no quick recovery, no rapid replacement of crews, aircraft, or confidence. What had been lost was not only material, but time and initiative. In war, momentum is fragile. Once broken, it does not return easily. At Wewak, the destruction of aircraft was only the visible damage. Beneath it lay a deeper rupture, the sudden understanding that control had passed to the enemy, and that it would not be reclaimed through effort alone. As smoke thinned and silence settled over the fields, the realization took hold that this was not a pause before action, but the end of one chapter entirely. The airfields would remain. The wreckage would cool, but the role they once played in the war had already slipped into history. When the final tallies were compared, the imbalance was stark. Allied losses were minimal, so small they seemed almost incidental against the scale of what had been achieved. Aircraft returned low on fuel but intact. Crews exhausted yet alive. There were no long lists of missing squadrons, no desperate searches over sea and jungle. The operation had succeeded at a cost that defied traditional expectations of air warfare. For the Japanese forces in northeastern New Guinea, the effect was immediate and devastating. Air power in the region did not degrade gradually. It collapsed. The loss of so many aircraft at once removed the ability to contest the skies, to protect ground forces, or to strike advancing Allied positions. What had been a functioning air arm in the morning became a memory by nightfall. The consequences rippled outward with speed. Subsequent Allied operations encountered little resistance from the air. Convoys moved with greater confidence. Ground advances proceeded under a widening umbrella of protection. Where planners had once accounted for Japanese air interference as a major factor, they now planned around its absence. The battlefield had been simplified in ways that could not be reversed. This shift was not temporary. Replacement aircraft could be shipped, but experienced crews could not be conjured on demand. Training pipelines were slow, and fuel shortages already strained operational capacity. Even if machines returned, the cohesion and confidence required to use them effectively had been broken. The region would not recover its former balance. In strategic terms, the initiative changed hands decisively. The Allies no longer reacted to Japanese air strength. They shaped operations assuming its weakness. Choices that had once seemed risky now appeared feasible. Timetables shortened. Objectives expanded. Control of the air so often contested inch by inch had been secured in a single morning. Wewak quickly took on a meaning beyond its geography. It became a warning, studied and discussed far from the smoking runways where the lesson had been written. The message was simple and unsettling. No base was too distant. No concentration too secure. The assumptions that had once defined safe rear areas no longer applied. Distance, once a protective moat, had been crossed with calculation and discipline. Jungle, once a barrier, had become a corridor. The tools of war had changed, but more importantly, the way they were used had evolved. Intelligence, timing, and restraint had proven as decisive as numbers or firepower. In the days that followed, the wreckage at Wewak cooled under rain and sun, while operations elsewhere pressed forward with new confidence. The war had not ended, but it had shifted direction. A threshold had been crossed, quietly and irrevocably. What happened at Wewak did not announce itself with speeches or declarations. Its significance emerged in absence, in skies that remained empty, in attacks that never came, in resistance that failed to materialize. And in that absence lay the clearest proof that the war in the Pacific had been changed not by a prolonged campaign, but by a few decisive hours. The most visible losses at Wewak were counted in wrecked airframes and blackened runways, but the deeper damage lay elsewhere. Veteran aircrews, men who had survived earlier campaigns, who understood the Pacific's distances and weather through hard experience, were killed where they stood or scattered beyond recovery. These were not easily replaced assets. They were repositories of judgment, memory, and restraint, erased in moments. Training pipelines continued to function on paper, but paper could not substitute for experience. New pilots could be taught procedures, formations, and checklists, but they could not be taught instinct at speed. They had not learned how to read the sky over jungle, how to judge fuel by sound and vibration, how to sense danger before instruments confirmed it. Those lessons had been learned by the men lost at Wewak, and learned slowly. The effect on morale was immediate and enduring. Survivors did not simply grieve individuals, they mourned a sense of continuity. Units that had once carried shared history were fractured, their internal confidence shaken. The realization that preparation and professionalism had not saved them introduced a corrosive doubt. If this could happen here, after everything done correctly, then safety itself became suspect. Confidence in leadership suffered accordingly. Decisions that had once seemed prudent now appeared naive. Assumptions that had gone unchallenged for months were re-examined too late to matter. The gap between what had been promised security through distance and what had been delivered destruction without warning was impossible to ignore. Authority weakened not through rebellion, but through quiet disillusionment. As losses mounted, tactical flexibility began to disappear. Air units that had once planned offensively now struggled simply to exist. Reduced numbers meant fewer options, shorter reach, and increased predictability. Risk tolerance collapsed. Where commanders had once weighed multiple possibilities, they now avoided exposure altogether. Conservatism replaced initiative, not as a choice, but as a necessity. Defensive thinking arrived, but it arrived late. Aircraft began to disperse where space allowed. Camouflage improved. Alert levels were raised, but these measures addressed symptoms rather than causes. They were reactions to a lesson already learned by the enemy. The initiative required to shape the battlefield had passed elsewhere, leaving only adjustments made under pressure. The cumulative effect was acceleration of decline, of limitation, of narrowing choices. Each loss reduced the ability to absorb the next. Each cautious decision invited further pressure. In air warfare, recovery depends not only on material, but on confidence in systems and assumptions. At Wewak, those assumptions had been stripped away without replacement. What made the damage enduring was that it could not be repaired quickly, if at all. Aircraft could be shipped. Airfields could be rebuilt, but trust in distance, in routine, in the predictability of war, could not be restored. Once uncertainty becomes the default, every operation carries additional weight, every decision additional fear. In the months that followed, the absence of those lost crews was felt not in single moments, but in accumulated hesitation. Opportunities passed unseized. Risks were declined. The war continued, but with less elasticity, less imagination. What had been destroyed at Wewak was not only a force, but a way of thinking about security. And so, the true consequence extended beyond one morning's devastation. It lived on in quieter skies, constrained plans, and a persistent awareness that the enemy had learned faster. Long after the wreckage was cleared, that imbalance remained an invisible loss, compounding, shaping every decision that followed. Wewak exposed a fatal assumption that had shaped planning long before the first bomb fell. It was the belief that war could be divided cleanly into fronts and rears, into zones of danger and zones of safety. As long as the front line held, the rear was expected to endure productive, predictable, and largely untouched. At Wewak, that distinction collapsed in fire. Modern war had already begun to erode the idea of rear areas, but the lesson had not been fully absorbed. Distance once imposed limits on what aircraft could attempt. Geography once delayed or diluted attack. By 1943, those limits were shrinking, replaced by range, calculation, and coordination. What had changed was not only technology, but imagination, the willingness to consider that no place was truly beyond reach. At Wewak, concentration became vulnerability in its purest form. Aircraft gathered for efficiency, crews clustered by routine, resources centralized for control. These choices made sense within an older framework, one that assumed warning would precede danger. But when warning vanished, concentration amplified loss. The very order that sustained operations also accelerated destruction. Routine played its part quietly. Repetition created confidence, and confidence dulled perception. When the same actions are performed without consequence, they begin to feel immune to consequence. Engines warmed at familiar hours. Aircraft were parked in familiar rows. Each uneventful day reinforced the belief that the next would be the same. Routine did not cause the attack, but it made the attack decisive. Strength, measured in numbers and machines, proved less important than surprise. At Wewak, the attackers did not need overwhelming force. They needed only accuracy, timing, and the freedom to strike first. The defenders possessed aircraft, crews, and firepower, but none of it mattered once surprise removed the chance to employ them. Power unused is power already lost. From this imbalance emerged a harsher truth. Adaptation was no longer optional. Survival depended on the ability to question assumptions before the enemy did. Dispersal, warning systems, flexible planning, these were not signs of weakness, but acknowledgments of reality. To adapt was to accept uncertainty and plan within it, rather than deny it altogether. Those who failed to adapt did not always fall immediately. Sometimes the cost appeared later, expressed in missed opportunities and narrowing choices. But the direction was set. In a war where reach expanded faster than belief, those who clung to old certainties found themselves reacting rather than shaping events. Over time, reaction became irrelevance. Wewak did not invent these truths. It revealed them with unusual clarity. The illusion of safety had already been cracking across the Pacific, but here it shattered completely. No jungle was thick enough. No distance was long enough. No routine was harmless enough to guarantee protection. In the end, the lesson was not about one base or one morning. It was about a shift in the character of war itself. When every place can be reached, every place must be defended not always with weapons, but with attention, skepticism, and readiness to change. Those who understood this would go on to shape the rest of the conflict. Those who did not would find their forces diminishing, not always in dramatic defeats, but in quiet erasures like Wewak. And in that difference lay the dividing line of modern war, not between front and rear, but between those who adapted in time and those who vanished while believing they were still safe. After the smoke thinned, rain came. Warm jungle showers fell steadily over Wewak, hissing as they struck twisted metal and cooling wreckage that had burned only hours before. Water pooled in bomb craters and ran in dark streams along the remains of runways. The violence of the morning receded, replaced by a quiet that felt unnatural, almost intrusive, as if the landscape itself were struggling to absorb what had happened. Engines sat silent beneath that rain. Propellers were bent or frozen in place, cockpits scorched, instruments melted beyond recognition. These machines had been prepared for missions that would never begin. They had been fueled, armed, and inspected with care. Yet they would never test themselves against an enemy in the air. Their entire contribution to the war ended where they stood. In military terms, it was a victory without resistance. No formations clashed, no pilots measured skill against skill. There was no exchange of fire in the sky, no chance for recovery through courage or improvisation. One side arrived with surprise. The other never truly entered the fight. The outcome was decided before the first engine reached full power. The meaning of that outcome extended far beyond New Guinea. Commanders elsewhere studied the aftermath and recognized a pattern that could not be confined to one place or one moment. If aircraft could be destroyed so completely on the ground, then air power itself had to be reconsidered. Its decisive phase was no longer only in flight, but in preparation, disposition, and awareness. What Wewak demonstrated with unusual clarity was that air power is decided before takeoff. It is decided in how aircraft are parked, how routines are protected, how assumptions are tested. Once bombs begin to fall, options narrow rapidly. The opportunity to adapt has already passed. In that sense, the battle at Wewak was over long before dawn. The war punished certainty here with particular severity. Certainty that distance was protection. Certainty that routine implied safety. Certainty that warning would arrive in time. None of these beliefs were foolish when first adopted. All had once been grounded in experience. But war evolves faster than belief, and what is not questioned hardens into vulnerability. For the men who had worked those airfields, the irony was cruel. They had done their jobs well. Aircraft were serviceable. Crews were prepared. Engines were warm. Readiness, in every technical sense, had been achieved. Yet readiness alone was not enough. Awareness mattered more. Flexibility mattered more. The ability to imagine what had never happened mattered most of all. The wreckage at Wewak eventually disappeared. Metal was salvaged, airfields repaired, jungle reclaimed what fire had cleared. But the lesson endured, carried forward into planning rooms and operational doctrine. Bases were dispersed. Warning systems improved. Surprise was no longer treated as an unlikely anomaly, but as a central danger to be anticipated. Still, the lesson was not universally learned, nor could it ever be permanently secured. Each generation of war tempts its participants to believe they have mastered its rules. Each period of stability invites confidence. Wewak stands as a reminder of how quickly that confidence can be undone. In the end, the story is not about 60 bombers alone. It is about the space between preparation and perception, between readiness and imagination. Those aircraft were ready for battle in every visible way. They were not ready for the one thing that mattered most. They were ready to fly. They were ready to fight. They were ready for war. They were ready for everything, except surprise.